Welcome to the online lecture for Chapter 3, Part 2. In this lecture, we're going to talk all about acids and bases, pH, and something called buffers. You should use this lecture in conjunction with your guided notes for Chapter 3, Part 2, which of course you should have completed before you come to class. To understand acids and bases, we really need to talk about good old water one more time. Now, what does water have to do with acids and bases? Well, imagine that you have a jar of just pure water molecules and they're just sitting around. In that state, water molecules will occasionally break down, and they break in a way that we call dissociation, which means that they break into two ions. Now, what's going on there? Why do they break into ions? Well, that has to do with electronegativity and the polarity of water again. When this water molecule breaks down, that greedy electronegative oxygen atom is going to steal the electron from hydrogen. And it actually kicks that little hydrogen out all by itself. So because the oxygen has gained an electron, it has a negative charge. Because the sad little hydrogen ion over here has lost its little electron, we say it has a positive charge. So the result of this reaction is an ion called hydroxide, or OH negative, and an ion called hydrogen, called H+, or just a hydrogen ion. Now there's another weird reaction that can result from this. Sometimes those hydrogen ions that are produced will join up with other water molecules and form this weird H3O thing called hydronium, and that happens occasionally too. For our purposes, we're going to focus on this top reaction up here. So why do we care about the dissociation of water? Well, as I described in the last slide, water will dissociate or break down into two components, hydrogen ions, H+, and hydroxide ions, OH negative. H+, when you see H+, I want you to think acid. That's the major component of an acid. When you see OH negative, hydroxide, I want you to think base, because that's one of the major components of a base. So water actually contains both an acidic and a basic component. This is the reason that pure water is considered neutral, is because it has both a basic and an acidic component. One more detail that I forgot to mention that's kind of important. The hydrogen ion goes by several different names. It can just be known as a hydrogen ion. It can also be known as a proton. Now, why is that? Well, let's think about hydrogen. Here's the little nucleus of hydrogen. Here's its electron shell. It has an atomic number of 1, so it has one little electron. If it loses that electron, as it does in this case, it's going to have no electrons. So really, that is just a little tiny proton with a sad little positive charge floating around in space. For that reason, we can call hydrogen ions protons. So sometimes you'll hear me refer to them that way. Now let's consider what happens when we reverse this reaction. If we take some acid, some hydrogen ions, and some hydroxide and put them together, they get together in such a way that forms water again. The negative of the hydroxide is going to be attracted to the positive of that little hydrogen, so they're going to get together and form good old neutral water. For this reason, when you combine an acid and a base together, we call this a neutralization reaction. Chemicals that we refer to as acids and bases are made of more than just water. Of course, they have other chemical components. So what happens when we combine an acid and a base together? Well, here's a good example. Here we have an acid, hydrochloric acid, and here we have sodium hydroxide, a base. When you mix hydrochloric acid with water, it will dissociate into two components, hydrogen ions and chlorine ions that are negative. Sodium hydroxide will also dissociate when you mix it with water. It will turn into sodium ions that are positive, and hydroxide ions that are negative. What happens when we combine these things together? Well, if you mix this acid with this base, what's going to happen is that the hydrogen ions are going to be attracted to the hydroxide ions, and they are going to end up forming good old water. That's what we saw before. Now, what about the other two components? Well, the chlorine ions and the sodium ions are going to be attracted to one another, and so that's going to form an ionic bond, and we call that good old table salt, NaCl. So in general, the two products of a neutralization reaction are salts, like this table salt, although there can be others. Remember, salt refers to a classification of chemicals, not just table salt. And the other product is going to be water, which we spoke about before. So salt and water. The presence of these acids and bases can have a dramatic effect on life. It can affect how your cells function, how your bodies function, and it can affect how ecosystems function. Here we have a couple of dramatic examples. Here we have a volcanic lake. It's located in Ethiopia, and it's extremely acidic. And from the air, you can see that the water is even kind of green looking. Here's another example of a really cool environment. This is Lake Natron in Tanzania, and it's extremely alkaline. There are certain sections of this lake that are so alkaline that wildlife that stumble into it sort of become mummified. So what we're seeing here is a mummified flamingo, and there's some very dramatic photographs of different kinds of wildlife that died around this lake. Now we do have environments sort of like this in the United States. There are alkaline lakes in Utah, for instance. But for the most part, we're going to talk about things that are a little bit more subtle, the effects on individual cells, for instance. Let's define what an acid is. Now, you might be familiar with acids such as citric acid or carbonic acid. These are things you find in citrus fruit and sodas, and things like Topo Chico has a lot of carbonic acid in it. Acids tend to be a little sour in taste, and they can be corrosive if they're really strong. Chemically speaking, an acid is any chemical that releases hydrogen ions into a solution. Now, because hydrogen ions are also known as protons, acids are also known as proton donors, so they give away hydrogens. Here we can see this with hydrochloric acid, good old HCl. When it's mixed with other chemicals, it tends to dissociate, and it will release chlorine ions that are negative, and here's that good old acid component. Here's our protons. So this is a proton donor. Next, let's define bases. In everyday life, you might be familiar with bases such as baking soda or ammonia. Bases tend to have a bitter flavor. They also tend to have a slippery feel on the skin. We also know bases as being alkaline. So alkaline chemicals are basic. Now, what are they and what do they do? Well, bases can actually act in two different ways. They can act by increasing the hydroxide concentration within a solution, or they can reduce the amount of hydrogen that's in a solution. Because they can take up and remove protons, H+, from solution, we also know them as proton acceptors. Let's look at a couple of different examples of bases and see these different actions. One way that a chemical can act as a base is by releasing hydroxide ions. So here, for instance, we have sodium hydroxide. This is a base that you will play with in lab. When it dissociates, when you mix it with another chemical, it tends to break into sodium ions and hydroxide ions. That's our basic component right there. Now, why do we care about that? Well, this is important because hydroxide ions can interact with hydrogen ions to form water. So if there's any acid in a solution, the hydroxide ions will interact with it and take it up and neutralize it and form water. So a base here is acting as a base by removing hydrogen, and it can do that because it released hydroxide. Another action that bases can take is by directly taking up hydrogen ions, directly accepting protons. Here, for instance, we have NH3 or ammonia, and what it's going to do is it's going to interact with hydrogen in the solution. So if you mix ammonia with an acid, it will take this hydrogen and it will stick it onto itself and form this weird thing called ammonium, which does have a positive charge, NH4. Because it added that hydrogen to itself, that hydrogen is no longer floating around in solution, acting like an acid. So this chemical is acting as a base. It's removing protons from the solution. Time for a your turn. Now this your turn is going to take you a little bit of time, but that's okay. I think it's really going to help you understand and visualize the actions of acids and bases. What I would like you to do is visit this link, and I did put this link both on the guided notes and in the comment that you'll see to the left of the screen. I want you to answer the questions that are on the guided notes and work your way through this module for the sections that say acids and bases, and then come back to the lecture.